If you believe experience still matters, if you've ever been quietly replaced by someone who thought confidence was enough, subscribe. Not for drama, but for stories that remind us why patience, skill, and preparation still win. My name is Michael Carter. I'm in my early 50s, divorced, two kids finding their own way, and for almost 2 decades, I helped keep a freight operation running smoothly while most people slept. The morning everything changed didn't feel special at first. Coffee was brewing. The house was quiet. Just another weekday. Then an email landed in my inbox. No greeting. No real subject. Just urgency. Loud, messy urgency. Someone wanted a meeting immediately. That alone told me plenty. People who understand real pressure don't panic in writing. They don't shout through capital letters. They act calmly that I didn't rush. Experience teaches you something simple. When someone demands speed, it's often because they didn't prepare that I arrived a few minutes early, same as always. Not to impress anyone, but because habits built over decades don't disappear. The conference room felt colder than usual, and someone was already sitting in my chair. Young, well-dressed, expensive confidence, the kind you rent before you've earned it. He looked up and smiled. "Thanks for coming in early," he said. "We'll keep this short." That sentence carries weight when you've heard it before. I noticed the third chair. Human resources, silent. Eyes fixed anywhere but on me. That's when certainty settled in. The explanation came wrapped in smooth language. Efficiency, modern direction, fresh leadership. My position, apparently, was no longer necessary. Years of work reduced to a bullet point someone wanted gone. He smiled as he said it, like he'd just fixed a complicated problem by deleting an old file. I felt pressure rise in my chest. Not fear, not surprise, restraint. The same restraint you learn when reacting would feel good, but cost you later. I didn't argue. Didn't list achievements. Didn't remind him how many problems never reached his desk because I handled them first. I closed my laptop. Stood up. Understood. I said no speeches. No begging. Just calm acceptance. The kind that unsettles people who expected resistance. Walking back to my office, I felt clear. Focused. I packed what mattered, family photos. A small keepsake from an earlier life that taught me discipline before comfort. And then I found something I hadn't touched in years. A small drive, tucked away. Labeled carefully, not sentimental. Practical. At my age, starting over isn't exciting. It's heavy. Responsibilities don't disappear just because someone younger thinks you're outdated. But here's what people like him never understand. When you've rebuilt things before, you don't panic when they break again. You prepare. I left without drama. No scenes. No threats. Why would I? You don't warn someone when they've already pulled the wrong piece out of the foundation. At home, I ignored the temptation of a strong drink and opened a cabinet that still held order. Inside were documents most people forget until they matter. Agreements. Old evaluations. And one envelope that had never needed attention. Until now. As I read, slowly, carefully, something became very clear. What happened that morning wasn't leadership. It was ignorance wearing confidence. By the time I closed the folder, 3 truths stood firm. The decision made that day wasn't final. The company was standing on something it didn't fully own. And silence was about to do far more damage than anger ever could. I sent a few messages. Precise. Calm. Then I made breakfast. Because when you've lived long enough, you learn something important. Real consequences don't arrive loudly. They arrive on schedule, and somewhere across town, someone who thought experience was expendable was about to learn what happens when you remove the one thing holding everything together. The first sign wasn't loud. It never is. It was a shipment that didn't arrive where it was supposed to. Early in the day, the kind of mistake most people shrug off and fix before lunch. Except this one didn't fix itself. A customer called. Then called again. By the third call, voices had sharpened. Inside the building, someone blamed a software hiccup. Someone else blamed bad data. No one blamed the decision made the day before. Yet, small problems have a way of multiplying when the person who used to catch them quietly isn't there anymore. By late morning, accounting noticed something else. Invoices that didn't line up. Numbers that weren't wrong, just incomplete. They checked again. Still wrong. Someone joked about the system acting up. Nobody laughed. Across the executive floor, confidence was still being worn like armor. Meetings ran long. Buzzwords filled the air. Efficiency. Optimization. Innovation.my name didn't come up. Not yet. That changed when an operations manager paused mid-sentence during a routine update. Just a pause, half a second longer than it should have been. Enough to draw attention. Can you clarify that? Someone asked. He couldn't. That's when the mood shifted. Not panic. Not yet. Unease. The kind that creeps in quietly and settles before anyone notices it's there. At mid-afternoon, a junior developer was doing routine maintenance. Nothing special. Nothing strategic. Just checking dependencies, the digital equivalent of looking under the hood. What he found made him lean back in his chair and stare at the screen longer than normal. Buried deep in the system was something that hadn't been fully erased. Not flashy. Not obvious. Just permanent. A signature. Ownership markers woven into the framework. Not on the surface, but in the bones. He didn't announce it. Didn't run to impress anyone. He took screenshots. Saved logs. Did exactly what careful people do when they realize they've stumbled onto something dangerous. It'd be why the time his manager saw the note on the desk, the day had already changed direction. Legal was contacted, quietly. Compliance followed. Files were requested that hadn't been touched in years, and somewhere between those departments, my name surfaced, first, cautiously. Like people weren't sure they were allowed to say it. Then more openly, whispers in hallways. Side conversations in break rooms. I still hadn't replied to anyone. That wasn't stubbornness. It was strategy. Because when people panic, they want reassurance. They want responses they can cling to. Silence forces them to face the problem without a safety net. Late that evening, my phone rang. I watched it, then let it go to voicemail. A moment later, it rang again, straight to voicemail. The message tried to sound casual. It didn't. There was a crack in the voice, subtle, but there. Negotiation creeping in where authority used to live. I didn't call back. I didn't need to. The next morning, things escalated. Emergency meetings appeared on calendars without explanations. Conference room doors closed earlier than usual. Conversations stopped when certain people walked by. One board member, known for saying very little, said nothing at all. That silence carried farther than any announcement. Late morning, a presentation that had been promoted for weeks disappeared from the schedule. No explanation. Just gone. Power rarely disappears all at once. It erodes, quietly, until someone looks around and realizes they're standing alone. Meanwhile, I went about my day like nothing unusual was happening. Made coffee. Read the news. Reviewed documents I already knew by heart. Because preparation isn't panic, it's patience. Inside the company, desperation began showing its edges. A request came down to review system logs. Then another. Then a demand. The junior developer was called into a closed room. Voices dropped. Doors shut. Questions were asked that didn't sit right. Then came the suggestion. Not written. Not recorded. Just implied that he didn't agree. People with integrity don't announce it. They simply don't move when pushed. By late afternoon, an email marked urgent landed in multiple inboxes at once. Carefully worded. Legally padded. Enough distance to pretend it was routine. It wasn't. That message didn't calm anything. It made everything worse. Access permissions were adjusted quietly. Not revoked, just limited. The kind of move you make when you're not ready to admit what you already know, but you're starting to feel it. That night, a man who had built his authority on momentum sat alone in an office that suddenly felt too large. Confidence doesn't like tight spaces. Once doubt slips inside. Across town, I closed one final folder and set it aside. Everything was moving now. And somewhere between denial and realization, someone finally understood the truth they should have learned. Earlier, you don't remove the foundation and expect the building to stay polite. You don't dismiss experience and expect consequences to wait their turn. And you don't mistake silence for weakness, especially when it's deliberate, because silence isn't absence, it's pressure, building steadily. Pressure doesn't explode right away. It settles, then tightens, then starts breaking things from the inside. That be why the next morning, the executive floor felt different. Not louder, quieter. The kind of quiet that comes when people realize they're no longer in control, but aren't ready to admit it. Folders appeared on the long conference table one by one. Thick, unbranded, heavy with consequences. This wasn't strategy. This was damage control. Legal spoke carefully, choosing words the way you handle fragile equipment. Every sentence came with weight. They explained what the systems were actually built on, who technically owned the framework, and what removing it would really mean. Not weeks, months, and even then, only if nothing went wrong. Someone asked if the systems could be replicated from scratch. The room went still. That question answered itself. Across the table, the man who once filled rooms with certainty shifted in his chair. Confidence didn't disappear, it thinned. Like ice cracking under steady pressure, he tried to regain footing, suggested modernization, innovation, a fresh rebuild. The words landed flat. Legal didn't argue. They just explained the consequences: lost clients, contract disputes, regulatory attention. Then came the phrase no executive ever wants to hear: willful misuse, followed by another: exposure. Each word pressed deeper than the last. That was the moment the room stopped pretending. Meanwhile, I remained exactly where I was, silent, because the moment people stop denying reality, they rush toward the person who's already accepted it. Late that afternoon, the call came. Not aggressive, not confident, measured. The voice on the other end spoke slowly, carefully, like every word was being tested before release. That I listened but didn't interrupt. When the call ended, I said only one thing: I'll review what you send. Then I hung up. Inside the company, the pace quickened. Emails multiplied. Threads grew longer. Messages were forwarded to people who shouldn't have been included because panic erases boundaries. Calendars filled with meetings labeled confidential, then rescheduled, then quietly canceled. Point one: executive visited a department he'd never stepped into before. Another asked questions that should have been asked years ago, and somewhere between the second and third emergency meeting, someone finally understood. The mistake wasn't letting me go. The mistake was underestimating what left with me. That evening, a courier arrived at my door. No logo. No small talk, just an envelope. Inside were offers dressed up as solutions: reinstatement, compensation, acknowledgement, carefully worded to avoid admitting fault. I read it once, then set it aside, because this wasn't about going back. It was about deciding what came next. The following morning, activity inside the building spiked early. People arrived sooner than usual. Voices were lower. Eyes avoided one another in hallways. Someone important had returned, and not everyone was invited to the room. Documents were spread out like evidence. Signatures highlighted. Dates circled. Every decision made since my departure was examined, slowly, painfully. The truth settled in. This situation couldn't be handled quietly anymore. That IT needed a face-to-face reckoning. That's when the invitations went out. Formal, direct, at a meeting that couldn't be postponed and couldn't be avoided. By the time I walked into the building, security nodded without speaking. Access still worked. For now, the conference room doors were already closed. Inside, everything waited. And as I took my seat, one thing was clear. This wasn't about my old role. It was about who actually held the leverage. The room didn't welcome me. It didn't need to. Everyone already knew why I was there. No one stood. No handshakes. Just eyes, measuring, recalculating. I took the seat offered and waited. Silence stretched longer than anyone liked. Finally, legal spoke, not in defense, not in accusation. In truth, they laid everything out, calmly, precisely. The system dependencies, the ownership clauses, the overlooked agreements signed years ago, when experience still had a voice at the table. No dramatics, just facts. The executive who had replaced me stared at the table longer than necessary. Confidence had nowhere left to stand. Someone asked the question everyone had been circling. What do you want? It wasn't hostile. It was tired. I didn't answer right away. Because when you've spent decades solving other people's problems, you learn to respect the moment before a decision. I don't want the job back, I said. That landed harder than anger ever could. A few heads lifted. I continued. I don't want apologies dressed up as policy changes. And I don't want anyone blamed to make this easier to swallow. I paused just long enough. I want a clean separation, clear acknowledgement of the work, and a transition that doesn't destroy the people who still depend on this place. No threats, no leverage stated out loud. None was needed. They agreed, faster than I expected, because this wasn't negotiation anymore. It was damage limitation. Terms were drafted carefully, reviewed slowly, and no rush. People who rush paperwork usually regret it later. By late afternoon, signatures appeared where resistance once lived. When it was done, the room felt lighter, but emptier. The kind of emptiness that follows learning something too late. I stood, gathered my papers, and thanked them. Not out of politeness, out of closure. Outside, the air felt different. Not victorious. Free. In the weeks that followed, I turned down offers quietly. Consulting roles, advisory positions, all tempting, all unnecessary. Instead, I did something simpler. I chose my time. Mornings became slower. Conversations deeper. I helped where help was asked, not demanded. And one afternoon, a message arrived from the junior developer, short, grateful that he'd found a place that valued caution as much as speed. I smiled, because that mattered more than any contract. Experience isn't loud. It doesn't shout. It doesn't be e.g. It waits. And when ignored, it doesn't chase relevance. It becomes consequence. So if you're listening to this and wondering whether years of quiet work still mean something, they do. Just not always where you expect. Sometimes the strongest lesson you leave behind is the one you never have to explain. And that is enough.